The world produces enough food to feed everyone. Yet for the first time since record keeping began, over 1 billion people across the globe are chronically hungry. Is this down to greed, mismanagement, or lack of political will? World leaders are gathering Rome to discuss the issue. Will there be more pledges made that are not kept? Or could it be the first serious collective effort to combat world hunger? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. A three-day conference hosted by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has begun in Rome. Its stated intention to find ways in which the world's hungry can be helped to help themselves. The delegates from more than 60 nations have already agreed on the draft document of a declaration that will end the gathering. The draft pledges to increase the amount spent on global agricultural development, but does not specify exact sums or the means of delivery. The draft also fails to mention a target date for the eradication of hunger, the main objective of the summit. The signatories are mainly developing leaders from the developing world. The Prime Minister of the host nation, Italy, is the only leader of the G8, the group of 8 industrialized nations, present, leading many to question the effectiveness of the summit and its objectives. Declarations about reducing global hunger have been made many times before. 13 years ago, at an earlier summit in Rome, this is what the heads of state and governments present had to say. We pledge our political will and our common and national commitment to achieving food security for all and to an ongoing effort to eradicate hunger in all countries with an immediate view to reducing the number of undernourished people to half their present level no later than 2015. But ever since, the number of hungry in the world has continued to rise. In April last year, the UN Secretary-General called on the international community to provide an immediate $755 million in emergency funds, a figure that was never realized. At this conference, the intention to provide some $44 billion over the next year towards agricultural development. That's up from the current level of an estimated $8 billion. Given what has happened or not happened in the past, is this realistic? Well, joining us today are our guests attending the summit in Rome, Abdulreza Abbasian, an economist with the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization. In The Hague, Sylvia Boren, co-chair of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. And in New Delhi, Vandana Shiva, an environmental activist and author. Let's begin at the conference venue in Rome. And despite the apparent pessimism, one apparent change is that in approach. There seems to be a shift from providing short-term aid to a more long-term strategy aimed at self-development. Abdulreza Abbasian, how important is this shift?
Well, this is very important for a long time, I would say. Whenever we had a crisis, the attention was what to do about it today, what to do about it tomorrow. And this sort of immediate action or immediate response mechanism sometimes have been successful, sometimes not so much, but it never really addressed the long-term issue. Now, I think that after going through the hardship of 2 years ago when prices rose so rapidly and so many countries found themselves in such difficult conditions, lessons have been learned. So now we know what the problem is. The problem is lack of investment in agriculture. And we know that this is not a problem that will go away without making long-term investment. So I think that this summit basically focuses on this issue and underlines the importance of long-term investment.
Let's go to Sylvia Boren in The Hague. Is this indeed the principal problem?
Well, it's very important that there is long-term investment, but the real question is how that investment is made. What we need here is gender green solutions per country, which means involving the small farmers, involving women particularly who are mostly the small farmers, getting them to find their own good, sustainable and green solutions, supporting them with the climate changes they're facing, which means they have to find new ways and new crops. All of this is possible. The fascinating thing about this time is that all the experts and the people on the ground seem to be agreeing about the direction of those solutions. What worries me a lot is the lack of financial pledges and the lack of a time that is given in this conference, because we've had pledges and pledges and pledges before, and the fact that so many people, 1 in 6 of the world, are going to bed hungry every day. And we've seen amazing amounts of money pulled out for the financial crisis, for the banks and for the corporates. $18,000 billion at least, the UNMC has calculated in this last year. And then we are still not sure whether this $44 billion that's being asked for here will actually be pledged.
Well, let's come back to these issues later in the programme, Sylvia. We'll move on to those as we go along. But let's go to New Delhi, India, a country where approximately, it's estimated, half of the world's chronically hungry people actually live. Vandana Shiva, the question to you is, this idea of long-term strategy rather than short-term emergency aid, is this a beneficial development, do you believe?
I think it's a beneficial development as long as the investment is, as Sylvia Boren said, for small farms, for sustainable practices, for women-centered knowledge, for farming. Unfortunately, we see a push for non-sustainable agriculture, for more chemical fertilizers at a time of climate change when we know fertilizers are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions like nitrogen oxides and increase the vulnerability of farming systems. More commodity production rather than more food self-sufficiency. We could grow more commodities, but if we continue with the system of production and distribution that we have today, we're going to have more hunger. We are using a system that reduces the available food tenfold through inefficiencies, and then it takes that and feeds it to cattle and reduces it another tenfold, which means 100-fold decrease in food availability. Only half of the food being grown today is going to human beings. The rest is going to factory farms and cars for biofuels. And that 50% in the rich countries is being wasted. We cannot afford to have a wasteful, inefficient system. Centralized systems will always be wasteful. If you compare the hunger and you see the profits of the giant corporations, you have a direct correlation. The years of the food crisis are the years in which the Monsantos and the Cargill walk away with super profits. I think it's time to return the control over food production to women and small producers. You can't anymore have agribusiness creating hunger. That is the core cause of the structural hunger in the world, including the hunger in India today, which has increased in the last decade of trade liberalization.
Well, let's go to Rome and Abreza Avassian, a representative of the FAO, the body that is attempting to raise the funds. We haven't yet started talking about how such funds should be delivered or indeed to what sectors. But the point that both our other guests have made at this stage is that the absolute critical point are those small families. It's estimated that 1/3 of the world's population are in fact small farming family groups. Does this taken into account when your organization is attempting to raise money and consciousness about the need to eradicate hunger?
Yes, well, I appreciate the comments. Those concerns are also the concerns of FAO. I do not see much divergence in views as were so eloquently expressed just a minute ago. The issue may be more about the way we go about doing it. United Nations, FAO, a specialized agency in agriculture, is an organization which represents its members' views. The members were here today. This was not supposed to be a pledging exercise. This was a summit about food, and the countries invited were here to really underline what is important, what now everyone understands. 2 years ago, we had many debates about this very issue, if you remember, and the issue about investment was a central role. But I think the focus was also looking at many other things, and today is not the case. Today we know exactly what the problem is. Now, how we go about doing it, how we're going to actually use the money that has been pledged or the investment that is going to come, in what sectors of economy or agriculture we're going to spend it. Is it that we're going to boost production through higher use of fertilizer and pollute more land and water? I accept that. Is that the reason? Is that what we're going to do? I don't think so. I think that FAO is trying its best to the extent it can to base its programs on and recommendations on scientific approaches. So, taking it from here, of course, as was mentioned, the rural poor counts a lot. 70% of the poor in developing countries are actually in rural areas, and most of them are lots of small farmers compose that 70%. So definitely, that is where we have to go and focus our attention. But the issue to basically wrap it all and say, well, look, you know, the big problem is that we just have enough food, but we are putting it into biofuels instead of, let's say, feeding people. I think that is going a little bit too much. Biofuel was definitely one factor for the high prices we saw, but we saw how also agriculture could adjust to that and perhaps will continue to do. I do not see much of a problem in terms of production, definitely in the coming years. The big problem is poverty. The big problem is really access to food. The big problem is what is happening in the rural areas. And the bigger problem is what the climate change is going to do, all of that, if we basically do nothing and carry on with the old policies.
But what we do have as well very clearly is a big gap between those who have and those who do not. The gap between the rich nations and the poor nations. Most Western nations offer significant subsidies to their farmers, making it difficult for farmers in the third world to compete. In Europe, large commercial farming groups each received at least €1 million in subsidies as of May this year. Last year, the US, for example, handed out $8 billion worth of subsidies to its farmers. Additionally, as we mentioned, advanced technology in agriculture contributes to the high quality and low cost of Western agricultural products, especially with many farmers in the third world still trying to implement basic mechanized farming methods. And, as we've mentioned too, with foreign countries buying up millions of acres of prime African farmland, for example, it leaves even less land for the third world to subsist on. And the drive by Western nations, particularly the US, to convert cereals and other crops into ethanol and biodiesel certainly would also appear to contribute to the problem. So here we have all these underlying issues. And Sylvia Boren, I saw you a little bit earlier shaking your head. This whole question about disparity surely lies at the very heart of how the issue can ultimately be resolved.
Well, of course, and we know it. We are playing, the West is playing a false game. I think it's $365 billion being subsidized to Western farmers, and we're not being clear about the $44 billion now asked for developing countries. We must make sure that the agro-business, as Vandana said, must stop their stealing of land, using it for biofuel in the wrong way. We must make sure that women and small farmers get opportunities, get land rights, get support, and they will easily double and triple their production if they get a little bit of support, and then the hunger can cease. The most absurd thing is that even the most traditional economists are now saying investing in the security, the financial security and the food security of local communities is one of the best ways forward, not just to stop poverty, but actually to grow an economy which is a green economy, which has green jobs, which has gender equity, and which will stop and halt some of the climate problems we're having. So whichever way you look at it, whether you look at it from the position of women, from the position of agricultural need, from the position of hunger, from the position of gender justice or climate justice, we come to the same solutions, which is, for goodness sake, invest in those local communities. The local politicians want this. The national politicians at times want it, but at times are put under pressure still from IMF and from the World Trade Organization. I think that it is possible now for the countries and the delegates that are in the meeting today to decide that they will not allow food to go out of their countries. There's no WTO rules against that. And to make sure that they keep their land and increase their food production at a very local level. And we're even seeing this in the West. There's a whole movement of the people growing their own vegetables. The vegetable movement could go, we want food to be back in the control of the people, and to have women and families to be able to have their food sovereignty, their food security. And this will actually mean that we can build a green economy from the base up. From there we can get trade, we can get local production of food going, and we can build a sustainable economy instead of the global bubble, the casino economy that we've been facing all the problems with this last year.
But the question is as well, is at what point, for example, there is a broad base of agreement here among all the guests that we have, but the issue surely remains that where does the start point begin? The conference taking place at the moment to raise some $40 billion to direct towards agricultural development. Vandana Shiva, is this a start point? Is this where it should begin? Must you actually have the funding, money, or actually must you have an intent and a political will to liberate those people who are hungry to be able to develop themselves?
Michael, at the beginning of the program, you observed that the rich country leaders are absent at the food summit. I can tell you the rich country commerce ministers will be very active at the end of this month at the World Trade Organization ministerial meeting. Now that is precisely where the hunger is being created. I've done calculations for India. Every year, rural producers are losing approximately $40 billion, the amount we are talking for investment for the whole world, because of falling prices as a result of dumping of subsidized, artificially cheap products. So we are talking about an unfair economy that is creating hunger, and that's why in the WTO, the developing countries have been constantly saying, stop treating food as a commodity, stop displacing our small farmers, and stop undermining our food security. I think we have to address the food security issues also in the World Trade Organization, not just at FAO summits, and it's vital that the robbing of the incomes of rural communities be stopped. The largest number of hungry people is, of course, in India, but across the world, the largest number of hungry people are now rural producers who are not able to get enough out of food production because of this dumping problem. And I don't agree that the issue is efficiency. You said that new technologies have made the food in the West cheaper. Subsidies have made food in the rich countries cheaper. You remove those $400 billion of subsidies in OECD countries, and we'll see how cheap the production of food through industrial systems is.
Once again, we have the question arising here.
Will win out straight away.
Once again, we have the question arising here. One very fundamental thing, we saw an economic collapse in recent months, and we saw billions of dollars being paid in payouts to financial companies. We did not see the same thing happening with food subsidy or food collapses around the world. To go to Abdulreza Bassian in Rome, is this one of the issues that is being considered by the world leaders? We heard from Vandana Shiva there, how everything is linked, that these issues should be addressed by the World Trade Organization as much as by the FAO. Your opinion on this?
Well, let me just, before answering that, there's one issue about the leaders attending the summit. Silvio Berlusconi, president of Italy, is also the president of G8. And as you know, he made the issue of food security, in fact, the G8 made the issue of food security as central to his declaration. And he basically carried on this message into this summit and in a way represented the other 7 members who were not present at the meeting. So the OECD was very well represented in that context. Now, the issue of financial, comparing basically what happened with the food situation compared to the financial market, well, the food market didn't collapse. financial markets did. And the collapse of the financial market had definitely, if it continued, if it actually carried on the way it was, would have had repercussion also on the food sector to a great deal. I'm not saying that what food received was what was needed. Absolutely not, far from it. And I think FAO, in every occasion we had, we also tried to make not the comparison, but simply put things in a correct context.
Sylvia Boren, I think you want to respond to that. Let's just hear from Sylvia Boren in response to that.
Yes, very quickly. The food market didn't collapse. No, people are dying of hunger. We have had poverty hearings. We've had poverty and climate hearings as GCAP all around the world. We had 173 million people joining us in October for the Stand Up and Take Action Against Poverty. And when people say the food market hasn't collapsed, I get really terribly angry, because it's people, it's children, it's marginalized people who are dying of hunger, and that collapse of life is not being taken into account with sufficient urgency. The 20 billion that was promised at the G8 in Italy earlier this year has not come through. Last year, 30 billion was being asked by the UN. Only 3 billion has gone out at all. That is a factor 6,000 less than what has been paid to the corporates and to the banks. The joke around the world is, if people were cars, we would get a bailout. I mean, when you say the food hasn't collapsed, no, people are dying of hunger. The people that need the food are not getting it. And it is amazing to me that the leaders are not acting on this with urgency and with money and with political will.
Vandana Shiva, what can be done? What must be done at this particular point? We know the extent of the crisis. What should be done?
I think the first thing is this massive land grab, where the productive land of small farmers is being appropriated violently and undemocratically. In India, it's being called the biggest land grab since Columbus. Look at Africa, millions of acres being grabbed. That has to stop if we've got to have people getting food and producing food. The second thing is seed sovereignty. Farmers must have right to their seed. Farmers must have access and freedom to share seeds. Food sovereignty, land sovereignty, those are the three pillars of the future of food security, along with climate resilience. When we put those four pillars together, people will have food, people will have the capacity to feed themselves, and food might not be a global market, but there will be effective production and effective distribution systems.
Abdulreza Abbasian, we're running out of time here, but we've heard from the other guests a central point, that underlying these talks, underlying the discussions, are people, men, women, and children. Does this genuinely play a part in the discussions that you are having in Rome?
I simply hope so. FAO simply hopes so. And again, let me say, it's not that we say the food, we had no food problem. Of course we do. 850 million that were hungry when we had huge reserves. So it wasn't just production issue, it was economic issue, it was a poverty issue. Today we have more hungry people, over 1 billion people, according to FAO calculation. So obviously it is a problem, and please don't get me wrong on this. A summit like this is the 4th summit, the first one being 1974, then we had one in 96, 2002, and this is the 4th summit. The difference between this and the previous summits is that I think we know and we have recognized exactly what the problems are.
Thank you very much indeed. That's all we have time for. Final thought, though, and that is, while we've been talking, once every 6 seconds, somewhere in the world, a child has died because of hunger. Thanks to our guests in Rome, Abdulreza Abbasian, in The Hague, Sylvia Boren, in New Delhi, Vandana Shiva. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.